So now we're going to hear from Steve Aldrich. Steve heads up BioEra, and BioEra has been a leader in the economic analysis of infectious diseases, including H5N1, avian influenza, and H1N1, pandemic influenza. And Steve was a founding member of the UN Towards a Safer World Pandemic Preparedness Network. He's worked with many governments, private sector companies, NGOs on pandemic preparedness and response. So we're very lucky to have Steve join us. Steve, thank you. And he's going to talk on facing up to the fear of infectious disease. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, good morning to all of you. We have to shift subject a little bit. And I first want to begin by thanking both Bisong and Brian and Jim for inviting me, giving me the honor of addressing you. My topic is kind of a bit of a downer in a way. Why fear is our greatest enemy and what we can do about it in pandemic preparedness and response. Well, to begin, I want to give you an acronym that you can take away that summarizes the major problem of my talk from the perspective of the evolutionary heritage we all carry forward with us, that we've inherited from our ancestors. F is for forget. That's what you are to remember. E is for everything. A is for and R is for run. Forget everything and run. This is the fundamental problem that we have inherited, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the significance of this. When we talk about fear, we should start by saying, what is it? And from my perspective as an evolutionary biologist, it's a complex biological adaptation to the presence of a potential threat in the environment. Fear really is a positive thing. It assists us in getting away from the threat, and it's very easy to imagine why it evolved. It's a very old thing. It's both a motivating emotion within organisms, and it's a social behavior within groups. And that's very important. Like infectious disease, fear evolved to be transmitted from organism to organism, especially in social species like ours. The biological system components that underlie fear have been evolving for a very long time, as I'll show in a moment, for at least the last billion years. And for the vast majority of that time, fear has been beneficial to us in almost all instances, but it's very maladapted as a response to some of the modern threats and circumstances that we encounter. Now, the fear response is something that's been very well studied, actually. We know a great deal about it, and I don't want to dwell on it. I just want you all to recognize that the parts of the brain that are involved in fear response are very, very old. So this is something that has been evolving for a long period of time. Interestingly, there are two kinds of fear response or circuits in the brain. One that mediates a kind of unconscious response. It's not mediated by your consciousness. It happens whether you're aware of it or not, and you can experience it in any circumstance when you are suddenly confronted with a start. If you're startled and you notice that your body is actually changing in ways that you didn't think of having it change, that's the fear response. So every time I am going through an airport and after going through security, I realize that I may have misplaced my wallet or left it, and I go like this and I'm suddenly panicked. That's that unconscious fear response. But there's also a conscious pathway, and that conscious pathway gives us some hope because in that conscious pathway, you go through the sensory cortex, that blue area in the top of the brain, and that allows the higher processing centers of the brain that involve thought to get involved. And that actually is one of the principal ways in which we can mediate fear, is through processes that do involve our prefrontal cortex and allow us to learn not to be afraid. So one of the best therapies actually for people who have fear disorders is meditation, is repetitive learning over time that's mediated by the prefrontal cortex. And you can indeed extinguish long-held fears through that vehicle. All of that is good. The problem is that this system, both the unconscious and the conscious system, are subject to manipulation. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Part of the dilemma that we face is a dilemma of actual risk versus perceived risk. Fear motivates action to avoid risk, and that's a good thing. But fear and anxiety arise from the perception of risk. And that may not have anything at all to do with the actual risk that is involved. So we all misjudge or misperceive the risks that we're exposed to. But since our perception of risk is highly influenced by what others perceive, the more others perceive a high or a low risk, the more likely we are to have that sense reinforced in ourselves. And so our own judgment is constantly being informed and influenced by what others perceive as threats in the environment or a lack of threat in the environment. Indeed, that is the way fear evolved. As I said, it evolved as a social behavior. It evolved to spread. And so you have the phenomenon which affects humans as well as other social animals like bison, of an animal in the herd that becomes suddenly startled or scared, and that fear that's experienced by that animal can spread very quickly to other animals, and you get, in this case, a stampede, which also happens in human circumstances. So part of the dilemma or the challenge of risk communications when we talk about fear is that we're seeking to align actual risk in many cases with perceived risk. And here's where the manipulation or the challenge comes in. When actual risk is great, but the perception of risk is low, it's quite natural for us to use fear-based communication to help raise the perception of risk. That aligns the actual risk with the perceived risk, which we want. When the reverse is true, we do just the opposite. When the perception of risk is high, but the actual risk is low, the need is to lower the perception of risk. And so we're reassuring in our communications, or we should be. The management of that is important. So Peter Sandman, who is a consultant in the risk communications area, well known in the pandemic area, framed this equation by what you should manage if you're trying to manage risk and risk response, or response to risk in a population. He said what you really should manage is hazard, which was his word for the actual risk, the real risk, plus outrage, plus the degree to which people are actually perceiving that risk as to what extent they're outraged by it. So you're managing not just the actual risk, you're managing, if you're trying to influence people, the combination of both both the actual risk and the perception of risk. But attitudes about infectious disease risk change. In 1969, the US Surgeon General testified before Congress that humanity might soon close the book, quote, close the book on infectious disease. And the United Nations Health for All 2000 Accord, which was adopted in 1978, predicted that by the year 2000, infectious diseases would no longer pose a danger to human health, even for the poorest nations. So that wasn't all that long ago that attitudes were very, very different. By 2000, the CIA had a different view. In a report entitled The Global Infectious Disease Threat and Its Implications for the United States, the CIA said, and I quote, "Infectious diseases are a leading cause of death, accounting for a quarter to a third of the estimated 54 million deaths worldwide in 1998. The spread of infectious diseases results as much from changes in human behavior, including lifestyles and land use patterns, increased trade and travel, and inappropriate use of antibiotic drugs, as from mutagens and pathogens." Now, we've heard all this from Eric and from Brian, and this just reinforces that message that this is a dynamic, very complex system of interchanging parts that all influence one another. I won't dwell on that fact, simply point out, because we've heard about it in earlier presentations. But just to say that the fundamental forces that are driving the emergence of new infectious disease threats are many, and they're fundamental. There's no simple solution to the problem. But we have witnessed a rise in the number of new emerging threatening infections in recent years. And these new emerging infections are causing, as we've heard already, significant economic disruption. This is a famous chart that my colleagues, including Jim Newcomb, put together on the relative economic impact of various emerging infectious diseases that have occurred just over the last 25 years or so. This is currently being updated, or the UK government has asked us to update it, so the next time I show it, it'll have even more bubbles. Bubbles for MERS, for MERS-CoV, bubbles for H7N9. So it continues to evolve. The main point to make is that these are big numbers, and there's no reason for them, there's no question in my mind that they will continue to get larger. A word on SARS and what we've learned, just to add to the conversation from a slightly different perspective. One thing I want to point out is that SARS was a kind of cascade event. It was, in time, a very narrow episode, only stretched out over about 6 months or so. But it, in that short period of time, had an enormous cascading effect across different scales and caused an enormous amount of economic damage. And there was equally a cascade of responses that the emergence of this event triggered. This is a very, very good example of what Brian was talking about in his initial talk of how complex systems, you can have small changes that cascade very rapidly across these different scales. To give you an idea, and I know Jim will give more information on this in his talk, this is what happened to Asian share prices during SARS. The curves are Asian share prices, and the blue area is the cumulative number of SARS cases. So we saw as the initial cases, as the disease started to spread and news leaked, that it had a very dramatic impact on Asian market prices. I would summarize very quickly the 7 lessons that we learned from SARS to be these. First, the economic contagion of fear spread in advance of the pathogen and did much greater economic economic damage than the disease itself. Of the $30 to $50 billion economic impact of SARS, only 1 to 2% of that impact was due to the direct costs of dealing with the disease. The vast majority of the impact was caused by secondary and systemic impacts on things such as supply chains, disruption of travel and trade as a result of the disease, not from treating the disease itself. Fear was amplified in the initial stages of the disease, and it was pointed out that we didn't know what the pathogen was. And that unknown quality, where we don't know, contributed to a sense of fear. And that was amplified by, and we see this a lot with government institutions and others, there are often economic or political interests that want to hold back information from the public for fear of creating panic. And sometimes that holding back of information can be very detrimental. It can actually contribute to fear. The most open economies, these are economies like Hong Kong and Singapore, were, when you go back and look at the impact on these economies, Canada was also included, that very hard hit relative to other economies. There was no evidence, you may recall from SARS, that there were some extraordinary measures taken to try to interrupt the spread of the disease at airports and other points of entry. There were special temperature measuring machines that were installed in airports, for example, and there was no evidence that any of the control measures at national borders had any significant impact on the spread of the disease. And that's important because there was an enormous amount of money spent on that, and it was hugely disruptive. Once the disease was contained, the economic rebound was swift. So for a short-term event like a SARS event, which took place only over 6 months, the economic disruption was not so, even though it was large, we were able to rebound or be resilient as an economy from that very quickly. Now, a pandemic of the type we're talking about would be a different thing altogether. A severe pandemic, as Brian pointed out early in his talk, could be much more disruptive, both in time and also over a much wider array of, and much more deeply into the global economy. And therefore, of the studies that have been done, and this graphic simply relates some of the estimates of the economic impact of pandemic influenza that have been made historically, the scale of the impact is in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. So this could be something, as Brian pointed out, that disrupted things quite significantly. Now, I want to point out, and this is very much in keeping with the Dow and with Brian's thinking of what is a complex system and how does it work. A pandemic event, we have a tendency to think about it simplistically as a virus emerges here and then spreads out from there, and that's what the event is. That's not correct. That isn't how a pandemic works. The dynamic of a pandemic is that you have disease popping out in various locations in a very, it popped out in Hong Kong, then it transferred very quickly to Toronto, and then it was here, and then it was there. So you have local disease events, local disease outbreaks, and it's the perception or the iteration between those local disease outbreaks and everyone seeing that globally that is a hugely important dynamic if you want to understand how a pandemic actually unfolds, how it actually works. The way that I had thought about this, based on my 20-something years of looking at it, is that the physical evolution, this iteration between local disease outbreaks and global perception and response can be mediated, or it's an important way of thinking about it, is that you have three things going on simultaneously. as this iteration takes place. You have the physical evolution of the virus and the disease, which I'll talk more about in a moment. You have the perception of the degree of threat that people experience, which I've told you is hugely important to understanding the damage or the scale of damage and disruption that this event is going to cause. And then you have the institutional responses, the major institutional responses of the major players. Well, each of these things, each of those three things is an uncertainty, a very, very fundamental uncertainty as to how this pandemic is going to unfold. And pandemics are driven by major uncertainties. If we think about it, the transmission rate of the virus, which, to take a recent example, the overall estimate of the H1N1 R naught or R sub 0 for H1N1 was somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6. And Mexico fit that pretty well. Mexico was an early outbreak center for the H1N1 pandemic, and the R naught came in at 1.4 to 1.6. But the estimate of H1N1 R naught in a New York City school, where there was an early outbreak in New York City, was 2.69. So there isn't one R naught. You'll find that is a myth. It's again this iteration between what's happening locally and the perception of what's going on locally in the wider world that's at issue. Other uncertainties include, how the virus is going to evolve, what's the virulence, and virulence is not just a genetic issue. It's not just an issue of the particular strain of the virus. Virulence is an interaction between human beings and their culture and how they're situated locally and the particular strain of the virus that they encounter. Again, we don't know what human reactions and responses are going to be, and we often have no idea, and we don't know, whether there'll be effective countermeasures in the form of pharmaceuticals or other interventions. So these three just a word about these three key uncertainties. There are also important signposts. Fear is going to vary widely, both from location to location and also over time, and it will spread in advance of the disease itself and will cause the largest share of disruption and damage. So if you're interested in monitoring in any pandemic, you must look for fear. You must monitor for signs of fear, and I'll get into that in a minute. Again, evolution, you must monitor for how the pathogen is changing and how local expression of the disease is changing. And response, you must monitor for what the major institutional actors are doing in response to the disease. Often, though, the actions that are taken in the early stages are counterproductive and create much more harm than good in the form of trade embargoes or other disruptive forms of intervention, but they must be monitored. So these are just, for each of these areas, I leave you with some things that can pragmatically be monitored in order to track the possibility of an emerging pandemic. I won't go through them all in the interest of time. What I will take a moment with is the idea that it also is important to think through in some kind of conceptual framework what might happen. And this is just an example of a conceptual framework that we developed based on the scenario methods which were developed at Royal Dutch Shell. And it's a simple decision tree, but it's very, very useful. It can be used as a starting point for thinking about what you, in your local environment, in your organization, in your country, in your region, would do in the advent of a pandemic. And it starts by saying, okay, we want to take a space of possibilities. So if is a global pandemic declared? These are major uncertainties. If no, then you're in the world of false alarms, okay? But if yes, the next question to ask yourself is, what is the R naught? What is the infection rate? If it's not very high, then you're likely to go off into a world of scenarios that have to do with manageable disruption. This may be disruptive, but we can manage it, okay? And, you know, I know that R naughts are uncertain and they change and they're local, but it's a way of thinking about it. If the R naught is high, then the next question is the virulence high? If it's not, you, again, go over to that world or that set of scenarios, and there are an infinite number that are manageable. It's a manageable disruption. But if the virulence is high, well, then we go into a scenario where, or a set of scenarios where fear is going to dominate. If you have a highly infectious, highly virulent pandemic happening, you're going to have a great deal of fear. And that's going to become the most important context for you to be thinking about. And so we want you to think about that world and those worlds where, okay, you might be able to disrupt that or not, in which case we're dealing with the aftermath of a global disaster. Okay, I have to finish up. What can we do, just very quickly? We can help reduce the risk of pandemic emergence at its source by supporting stronger disease surveillance and response across wildlife, livestock, and human populations. It becomes more expensive to deal with this the farther away the pandemic is from the source. The more we can cut it off at the source, the cheaper it is. We can also commit to serious scenario-based planning efforts, anticipate and prepare to counter and mitigate fear-driven herd behaviors. Please think about that. We can also support international and public-private cooperation. This meeting should, as a part of its outcome, pledge to unite with the wider community of pandemic preparedness people that have been at work, hard at work, through the UN and other agencies. And we can engage in thoughtful and creative thinking on how to achieve and maintain social distance in the event of pandemic. That's a good idea. And finally, I want to leave you with this. You can disorganize for a pandemic disaster, and believe me, that's important. I said yesterday that the first responder in a disaster is not going to be the government, it's not going to be the medical crew, it's going to be your neighbor. It's going to be the people who are next to you. And it's creating preparedness at that level, that is locally, that is the most important thing. And you should think about how to catalyze those efforts in a self-organizing way by promoting it. And one thing that I think is brilliant, if you haven't seen it, is the National Geographic television show called Doomsday Preppers. I would recommend that China immediately adopt Doomsday Preppers in Chinese, because it's a show in which your initial impression is the people who are locally preparing are kind of crazy. They're nuts because they're spending their resources to get ready for a hypothetical event. But what the television show does is it makes that activity legitimate. It makes it not crazy. You get used to it. It becomes a common part of being alive, and nothing can get us better prepared for disaster than having local preparation happen with your neighbors. Thank you very much. I ran over. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve, for a marvelously clear presentation. I thought it was very useful to have it pointed out that there are two routes to fear, the high road and the low road. The low road going to the thalamus and the amygdala, and the high road going from the sensory cortex to the prefrontal cortex, which can modulate that fear before it roots its way to the hippocampus. Now, it seems to me that since epidemiologists are saying that regarding pandemics, it's not if, but when. The crux of Steve's message is we have to find ways to enable fear to be managed consciously, because it seems to me that looking at the bio-era dynamic chart of the generation of fear through virulence, if we respond on the low road, we're all immediately in panic stations, and we don't have then a manageable situation, we instantly move to global disaster. So I feel that it's really helpful to understand this dynamic, that by being conscious and planning, maybe we can hold prospectively the concept of a pandemic in a manageable, containable way, rather than pitching ourselves directly into a catastrophic scenario. And that's not denial. So thank you very much for a very informative talk, Steve.